The scent of roses hung heavy in the twilight air that June evening in 1812 as Eleanor Ashworth found herself beneath the shadowed archway of Lady Somerset's garden arbor, her heart racing beneath the delicate lavender silk of her best gown as Frederick Ravenscroft, heir to the Duke of Thornfield, drew her deeper into the fragrant darkness away from the glittering garden party beyond the hedge. She should not have come, should not have answered his whispered request for just one moment alone, but after weeks of stolen glance and carefully orchestrated encounters in crowded ballrooms, she found herself powerless to resist the magnetic pull of his presence. His fingers trembled slightly as they found hers in the dim light, and when he spoke her name, it emerged as barely more than a breath against the evening air. She had known then what was coming, had seen it in the darkening of his eyes and the way he leaned toward her as if drawn by invisible threads, and though every lesson of propriety screamed for her to flee, she remained frozen as he cupped her face with infinite tenderness and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was everything she had imagined in her most secret moments and more, a conflagration that seemed to consume the very air between them, until the sharp gasp from behind the rose bushes shattered their private universe, and Lady Beatrice Pembroke emerged with eyes glittering with malicious triumph. The aftermath came swift as a guillotine's fall. The whispers that raced through the party like wildfire, her mother's white-faced fury, the way Frederick was immediately surrounded by his father's men and hustled away before he could speak a word in their defense, leaving Eleanor to face the avalanche of society's judgment alone. 5 years later, on a grey September dawn in 1817, Eleanor Ashworth rose from her narrow bed in Willowmere Cottage and moved through her morning routine with the mechanical precision of one who had long ago ceased to expect anything from life beyond the quiet duties of a paid companion. The grey wool of her dress matched the colour of the sky beyond her small window, and as she pinned her dark hair into its severe knot, she caught sight of her reflection and quickly looked away from the woman she had become at 24, old before her time, forgotten by the world that had once cast her out. Her aunt's bell summoned her to begin another day identical to the hundreds that had come before, and Eleanor gathered the Morning Post from the hall table without enthusiasm until her eyes caught the familiar violet seal on one particular letter. Charlotte's handwriting sprawled across the cream paper with an urgency that made Eleanor's fingers fumble as she broke the seal, and as her eyes scanned the hastily penned lines, the blood drained from her face and the letter slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers to flutter to the worn carpet below. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor's hands trembled as she bent to retrieve Charlotte's letter from the worn carpet, the cream paper crackling between her fingers as she forced herself to read the hastily scrawled words again, each line striking her heart with the force of a physical blow, while her mind struggled to comprehend what her younger sister had written in such obvious excitement. Frederick Ravenscroft was alive. Charlotte's violet ink proclaimed across the page, alive when all of society had mourned him as one of the glorious dead fallen at Waterloo 2 years past, alive and returned to England bearing the scars of his service and the full weight of his father's title, for the old Duke had died of grief 18 months ago, believing his heir lost forever. The letter slipped from Eleanor's nerveless fingers once more as she sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight as the implications crashed over her in waves of disbelief and something far more dangerous that she dared not name, even as Charlotte's words echoed in her mind with merciless clarity. He had been seen at his club just yesterday, her sister wrote, looking harder and more formidable than before, with a terrible scar marking the left side of his jaw, moving with the slight limp of an old wound, yet still commanding the room with his presence as he always had. Perhaps even more so now, with the weight of experience etched into every line of his bearing. But it was Charlotte's final lines that had drained the blood from Eleanor's face and set her heart racing with a painful mixture of fear and treacherous hope, for her sister reported with barely concealed glee that the new Duke of Thornfield had been making discreet inquiries about the whereabouts of Miss Eleanor Ashworth, asking after her with a persistence that had set tongues wagging throughout the ton. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the wild flutter of her heartbeat beneath the coarse grey wool of her dress, as she struggled to understand why Frederick would seek her out after 5 years of silence. 5 years in which she had been cast out of society, while he had gone on to win glory on foreign battlefields. 5 years in which she had assumed he had forgotten her existence entirely, as any sensible man would forget a youthful indiscretion that had nearly cost him his inheritance. The soft shuffle of slippers on the wooden floor announced Lady Agnes Whitmore's arrival in the small parlour, and Eleanor hastily attempted to school her features into their usual mask of calm competence, though she knew her efforts were futile when her aunt's sharp grey eyes immediately noted the letter crushed in her lap and the pallor of her complexion. "My dear child, whatever has distressed you so?" Lady Agnes asked, her voice gentle with concern, as she lowered herself carefully into her favourite chair, her small hands folded over the ivory handle of her walking stick, while she studied her niece with the penetrating gaze that age had not dimmed. Eleanor found she could not speak past the constriction in her throat, could only mutely hand over Charlotte's letter and watch as her aunt's expression shifted from concern to surprise to something that looked almost like satisfaction as she absorbed the news that had shattered Eleanor's carefully constructed world of grey resignation and quiet duty into fragments as sharp and dangerous as broken glass. 2 days had passed since Charlotte's letter arrived, 2 endless days in which Eleanor moved through her duties at Willowmere Cottage like a sleepwalker caught between waking and dreaming, her hands performing the familiar tasks of managing the modest household, while her mind churned with possibilities she dared not contemplate too closely. The afternoon light slanted through the parlour windows as Eleanor adjusted her spectacles and continued reading from the volume of poetry balanced in her lap. Her voice steady despite the turmoil within as she recited the familiar verses to Lady Agnes, who dozed peacefully in her chair with Pip curled at her feet. The dove-grey dress she wore bore its usual modest white collar, perfectly pressed despite the tremor in her hands when she had ironed it that morning, and she had caught herself more than once touching the small calluses on her fingers, wondering what Frederick would think of these marks of her reduced circumstances before sternly reminding herself that such thoughts were both foolish and dangerous. The cottage sat in blessed isolation at the end of an overgrown lane that saw perhaps 1 visitor a month, usually the doctor or the vicar, and Eleanor had almost convinced herself that Charlotte's news would remain just that, shocking intelligence from a world that had cast her out and moved on without her, when Pip's head suddenly lifted from his mistress's feet with a low whine of alertness. The spaniel's ears pricked forward as a sound reached them through the quiet afternoon, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, the unmistakable rhythm of wheels and hoofbeats on the rarely used lane that wound through the autumn woods to their door. Eleanor's voice faltered mid-stanza as the sound grew closer, her pulse quickening despite her attempts to rationalize that it must be Dr. Morrison come early for his monthly visit, or perhaps the carrier with supplies from the village, though neither explanation accounted for the quality of the sound, the smooth roll of well-sprung wheels, and the steady beat of matched horses that spoke of expense and purpose. Lady Agnes stirred in her chair, her sharp eyes opening to fix on Eleanor's suddenly pale face as the younger woman rose and moved to the window, the book sliding forgotten from her lap as she drew back the thin curtain to peer down the lane. The approaching carriage emerged from the tunnel of golden trees like something from a dream, its black lacquer gleaming in the late afternoon sun. the matched greys drawing it forward with an inexorable grace that made Eleanor's knees weak, even before her eyes found and fixed upon the crest emblazoned on the door. The Ravenscroft arms seemed to mock her from their field of blue and gold. The wolf rampant that had adorned Frederick's signet ring all those years ago now proclaimed in full heraldic glory on the carriage door, and Eleanor's hand flew to her throat as she stepped back from the window as though burned, her mind screaming denials, even as her treacherous heart recognized the truth that had come to find her at last in her quiet exile. Eleanor's feet seemed rooted to the floor as she watched the carriage door swing open, her breath catching in her throat as a figure emerged into the fading light of dusk. And even before her eyes registered the details of his appearance, her heart knew him with a certainty that made her knees weak and her carefully constructed defenses crumble like sand before an incoming tide. Frederick Ravenscroft stood beside his carriage for a moment, his dark blue coat impeccable despite the journey, his bearing still possessing that military precision she remembered even as everything else about him spoke of transformation, of trials endured and battles survived that had carved new lines into the face she had once known as well as her own. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw caught the dying light, a pale testament to violence of Yft, and as he moved toward the cottage door, she noticed the slight favoring of his right leg, the silver-topped walking stick in his hand bearing a wolf's head that gleamed dully in the twilight. Behind her, Lady Agnes stirred in her chair with a rustle of black bombazine, Pip whining softly at the approach of a stranger. But Eleanor could not turn away from the window, could not break the spell of watching Frederick approach her sanctuary with the same determined stride that had once carried him across a crowded ballroom to claim her for a dance that had changed everything. The knock at the door resonated through the small cottage like thunder, and Eleanor found herself moving to answer it without conscious thought, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch, aware of her aunt's sharp gaze following her progress across the room. The door opened to reveal Frederick standing on the threshold, and for a moment that stretched into eternity they simply looked at each other, 5 years of separation condensing into this single instant of recognition that struck Eleanor like a physical blow, for despite the scar and the hardness that war had etched into his features, his eyes remained the same deep brown that had looked into hers with such tenderness in a moonlit garden so long ago. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried new depths, rougher than she remembered. Touched with an authority that spoke of commands given and obeyed on distant battlefields, yet beneath it she heard something that made her heart contract painfully in her chest. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt absurd in her plain grey dress and modest surroundings. Acutely aware of how she must appear to him now, no longer the fresh-faced girl in lavender silk, but a woman worn down by disgrace and exile, her hands bearing the calluses of menial work, her face surely showing every one of her 24 years. "May I come in?" he asked, and there was something in the formal question that held layers of meaning, as though he were asking permission for far more than simply crossing her threshold, and Eleanor found herself stepping back to allow him entry, her voice deserting her entirely as he moved past her into the small parlour where Lady Agnes waited with keen interest, brightening her weathered features. The room seemed to shrink with his presence, the modest furniture and worn carpet thrown into sharp relief by his elegance, and Eleanor busied herself with lighting the candles against the gathering darkness, grateful for the excuse to avoid his gaze while she struggled to comprehend that he was truly here, in her exile, bringing with him all the memories she had tried so hard to bury beneath layers of duty and resignation. The candlelight flickered across Frederick's scarred jaw as Eleanor busied herself with the tea service, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the steaming liquid into Lady Agnes's best china cups. acutely aware of his presence, filling the small parlor like a physical force that pressed against her carefully constructed defenses. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the changes 5 years had wrought in both of them, and Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him as he conversed politely with her aunt about the weather and the state of the roads, his deep voice carrying that new roughness that spoke of commands shouted over cannon fire and orders given in the heat of battle. Lady Agnes proved herself an able conversationalist, drawing him out with gentle questions about his travels, while Eleanor fought to steady her breathing, fought to understand why he had come here to her exile when he could have any woman in England, when society would welcome him back as a war hero despite the old scandal that had ruined her. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, though the mantel clock showed barely 30 minutes had passed, and Eleanor found herself cataloguing the changes in him, even as she tried to armor her heart against whatever cruel game this might be, for surely a man who had survived Waterloo and emerged a duke had not travelled to this forgotten corner of the countryside simply to renew an acquaintance that had ended in disgrace. When Frederick finally set down his teacup and turned those intense brown eyes upon her, Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, for there was something in his expression that she could not read, something that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain unmoved. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice formal yet carrying an undercurrent that made her fingers tighten on her own cup. "I wonder if I might have the honor of calling upon you again, perhaps in 3 days' time." Eleanor opened her mouth to refuse, to tell him that such visits were neither proper nor welcome, that she had no desire to be reminded of a past better left buried. But before she could speak, Lady Agnes intervened with a brightness that brooked no argument. "But of course, Your Grace, we would be delighted to receive you," her aunt said warmly, and Eleanor could only stare at the elderly woman who had become her unexpected ally, this gentle soul who had taken her in when her own family had all but disowned her, now opening the door to possibilities Eleanor dared not contemplate. Frederick's gaze never left Eleanor's face as he rose to take his leave, and she found herself standing as well, moving mechanically through the motions of a proper farewell, even as her mind reeled with questions she could not voice. He paused at the parlor door, turning back to look at her with an expression that made her heart constrict painfully in her chest, and when he spoke his words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. "I never forgot, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, his scarred hands gripping the silver wolf's head of his walking stick. "Not once in 5 years." Then he was gone, leaving only his card on the side table and the echo of his words hanging in the air while Eleanor sank back onto the settee, her legs suddenly unable to support her as she heard his carriage wheels crunch on the gravel drive, carrying him away into the star-filled night that pressed against the windows like a living thing full of possibilities she had thought forever lost to her. Eleanor lay awake in the grey dawn of September 6th, staring at the familiar cracks in her bedroom ceiling while Frederick's words echoed through her mind with a persistence that made sleep impossible. Those 5 simple words carrying a weight that pressed against her chest and made her breath come short whenever she allowed herself to truly consider their meaning. The rain that had begun during the night continued its steady rhythm against her window, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the garden where she had paced restlessly until exhaustion finally drove her to her bed where, though rest remained elusive as her mind insisted on replaying every moment of his visit with the kind of detailed scrutiny she had once reserved for her favorite poems. She could still see the way the candlelight had caught the silver threads in his dark hair, premature marks of the trials he had endured, could still feel the intensity of his gaze as he had spoken those words that shattered 5 years of carefully constructed assumptions about his indifference to her fate. Rising from her bed, Eleanor moved to her small writing desk, where her worn volume of poetry lay open to the page she had been reading when his carriage arrived, though now the words swam before her eyes as her fingers found the hidden treasure between its pages. The pressed white rose he had given her that June evening when the world had been full of possibility, and neither of them had imagined how quickly everything would change. The flower had faded to the color of old parchment, its petals paper-thin and fragile as the hopes she had carried then, yet she handled it with the same reverence she might show a holy relic as memories flooded back with a vividness that made her sink into her chair, overwhelmed by the past she had tried so hard to bury. She could see him as he had been then, young and unscarred, moving through Lady Somerset's garden with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat, his eyes finding hers across the crowd with an intensity that had made her heart race even before he had approached to claim the dance that had begun their secret courtship. They had met in hidden corners and shadowed alcoves for weeks, stolen moments that had become the bright center of her existence, each encounter deepening the connection between them until that final evening when he had drawn her into the rose arbor and cupped her face in hands that bore no scars, his voice rough with emotion as he confessed that he could no longer hide his feelings, that she had become essential to him as breathing, as necessary as the beat of his own heart. The kiss that followed had been inevitable as sunrise, a claiming and a surrender that had seemed to stop time itself until Lady Beatrice's shocked gasp had shattered their private world and brought reality crashing down upon them with all the force of social condemnation. The scandal erupting with such speed that Frederick had been called to his regiment before they could speak again, leaving Eleanor to face the consequences alone, while he marched toward a war that would nearly claim his life and transform him into the scarred stranger who now sought to reclaim what they had lost. The clock in the hallway struck 2 as Eleanor smoothed the soft blue muslin of her dress for the 3rd time, the fabric whispering against her trembling fingers while she tried to calm the flutter of nervous anticipation that had plagued her since dawn, knowing that Frederick would arrive at any moment for his promised return visit, and finding herself both desperate for and terrified of his presence in equal measure. She had changed her dress twice already. First, choosing the safety of her usual grey before Lady Agnes had taken one look at her and declared that no niece of hers would receive a duke looking like a mourning dove, sending her back to her room where she had hesitated between the grey and this blue dress that she had not worn since arriving at Willowmere Cottage, finally choosing colour over caution, though she wondered now if it made her look foolish, like a woman trying to recapture something forever lost. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel sent her heart racing as she moved to the window, watching Frederick emerge from his carriage with that new, careful way he had of moving, favouring his left leg slightly as he made his way to the door, and she noticed that he seemed somehow less rigid than during his first visit. His shoulders not quite as tense, though his bearing remained that of a soldier even in civilian dress. Lady Agnes received him with warm courtesy, and Eleanor found herself studying him as he settled into what was becoming his accustomed chair by the fire, noting how he seemed to fill the small parlour with his presence just as before. Though there was something different in his manner today, a subtle relaxation that made him appear younger despite the silver threading through his dark hair and the scar that marked his jaw. The conversation began with the same polite pleasantries about weather and local news, but Eleanor could sense an undercurrent of purpose in Frederick's responses, a tension that suggested he had come with specific intentions beyond mere social calling. And when Lady Agnes rose after precisely 15 minutes to take Pip for his afternoon walk, her exit so transparently deliberate that Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, she knew the moment of truth had arrived. They stood in sudden silence as the door closed behind her aunt, the space between them charged with all the words unspoken over 5 years, until Frederick moved to the window, where autumn light filtered through the glass, illuminating the golden leaves that swirled in the rising wind outside. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then stopped, pulling off his gloves with deliberate movements that revealed hands marked by scars she had not noticed before, evidence of the battles he had survived. And when he turned to face her fully, his expression held an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I find myself at a loss for pretty words or gentle persuasion," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, carrying the weight of command and loss and something else she dared not name. "So I will speak plainly, and hope you will forgive my directness in what I have come to say." Eleanor gripped the back of a chair for support, feeling her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble under the weight of his gaze. Those brown eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness, now carrying shadows she could only imagine, and she found herself nodding, unable to trust her voice as he took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of pain endured and distances traveled. "I have come to ask if you would permit me the honor of courting you," he said simply, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "With the intention, should you find me acceptable, of making you my wife." The room seemed to spin around Eleanor as she stared at him, certain she had misheard. That this scarred duke who had survived Waterloo and emerged from the carnage of war could not possibly be standing in her aunt's modest parlour, speaking of courtship and marriage to a woman society had cast aside. A woman whose reputation lay in ruins because of a single stolen kiss 5 years ago. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Surely you cannot have forgotten that I am ruined, that society has long since passed its judgment upon me, that no respectable man would consider such an alliance with one whose name has been so thoroughly tarnished." Frederick's expression darkened, not with anger at her, but with something fierce and protective that made her heart constrict. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers through hell and emerged to claim his own destiny. "Society be damned," he said with quiet vehemence, moving closer still until she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes and catch the faint scent of leather and sandalwood that clung to him. "I care nothing for the opinions of gossips and hypocrites who judge worth by their own narrow standards, when I have seen true courage and honor on battlefields where their petty rules meant nothing." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Overwhelmed by the intensity of his declaration and the implications of what he was offering, this chance to reclaim a life she had thought forever lost. Yet still she hesitated, needing to understand why he had sought her out after so many years of silence. "But why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Why now, after all this time, when you could have anyone, when the world is full of young women whose reputations remain spotless and whose families would welcome such an alliance with joy rather than the scandal it would surely bring?" Frederick's jaw tightened, and she saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax, his limp more pronounced as he shifted his weight, the old wound clearly aggravated by the cold weather that had blown in with the gathering clouds. "Because there are things I must tell you," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. "Things that have haunted me through long nights in field hospitals and frozen camps. Truths I should have spoken 5 years ago before fate and war intervened to separate us so cruelly." He paused, seeming to gather himself for what he needed to say, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, afraid to move, lest she break whatever spell was allowing this moment of raw honesty between them. "Will you permit me to explain?" he asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression now, This man who had faced Napoleon's armies, showing uncertainty in the face of her potential rejection. "Will you allow me the chance to tell you why Eleanor Ashworth has remained the only name on my lips in moments when death seemed certain? The only face I saw when darkness threatened to claim me, the only reason I fought to survive when surrender would have been so much easier." The wind rattled the windows as Eleanor stared at him, feeling the last of her defenses crumbling under the weight of his words and the raw honesty in his scarred face. And she knew that whatever came next would change everything, would either heal the wounds of 5 years or tear them open beyond any hope of repair. But she also knew she had no choice but to hear him out, to finally learn the truth of what had driven him back to her after all this time. Eleanor could hardly breathe as she found herself alone with Frederick in the intimate space of her aunt's parlour. The sound of the closing door behind Lady Agnes seeming to echo through her very bones, while rain began to patter against the windows like nervous fingers tapping for entry, and she watched him move to stand before the fire, his broad shoulders tense with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I need you to understand," he began, his voice rough with suppressed emotion as he stared into the flames rather than meeting her eyes, "that when I left you that night in the garden, when I was called to my regiment before dawn without even the chance to send word, I carried nothing with me into war except my commission, my sword, and the memory of your lips against mine." The words struck Eleanor with physical force, making her sink onto the small settee as her legs suddenly refused to support her, and she pressed trembling fingers to her mouth as Frederick continued, still not looking at her, his scarred hands gripping the mantelpiece until his knuckles showed white. "My father was waiting when I returned to pack my few belongings, furious beyond measure at the scandal, threatening to disown me entirely if I did not immediately renounce any connection to you and marry the heiress he had chosen, a threat he nearly made good on before my godfather intervened to remind him that a son at war deserved at least the dignity of his name, even if nothing else." Frederick turned then, and the raw pain in his eyes made Eleanor's heart constrict as he continued. "I wrote to you, letter after letter in those first months, though I had no way to send them without knowing where your family had taken you, and James Sinclair will testify that I made him promise to discover your whereabouts, to ensure you were well, to bring me any news no matter how small." He moved closer, favouring his wounded leg as he crossed to sit beside her on the settee, maintaining a proper distance, though she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the rain on his coat mixed with that distinctive scent of leather and sandalwood that brought back memories of stolen moments in shadowed alcoves. "When James finally discovered you had been sent to your aunt in the country, I was already deep in Spain, fighting battles that seemed to have no end, watching men die in mud and blood, while your name was the prayer on my lips each night I survived to see another dawn." His voice dropped lower, more intimate, as he shifted to face her more fully, and Eleanor found herself mesmerized by the play of firelight across his scarred features as he spoke. "At Salamanca, when grapeshot tore through our ranks and I fell with half my leg opened to the bone, it was thoughts of you that kept me conscious while the surgeon worked, your face that I held in my mind's eye while fever tried to claim me in that fetid field hospital where so many did not survive." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Frederick continued, his own eyes bright with unshed moisture. "At Waterloo, when I took this," he gestured to the scar along his jaw, "from a French cavalry sabre that nearly took my head, when I lay beneath my dead horse for hours while the battle raged above me. It was the memory of your voice saying my name that kept me fighting to breathe, that made me claw my way free when darkness fell and the scavengers came for the dead." He reached out then, taking her right hand between both of his scarred ones with infinite gentleness, and Eleanor gasped at the contact. The first time he had touched her since that fatal kiss 5 years ago, feeling the rough patches where fire or blade had marked him, the calluses from sword and rain, the warmth that seemed to flow directly into her heart. Every dispatch I sent to James included the same question. Had he news of Miss Ashworth? Was she well? Had she married? And when he wrote that you remained unmarried, that you lived quietly with your aunt, I dared to hope that perhaps, impossibly, you might still harbor some small feeling for the fool who had failed to protect you from society's censure. Eleanor could not speak past the tightness in her throat, could only grip his hands as he continued. When peace finally came, and I returned to find my father dead, and myself master of a title I had never expected to inherit so soon, my first thought was not of the estates or the fortune, or the dozen heiresses my solicitors immediately suggested, but of finding you, of discovering whether the girl who had kissed me with such sweet passion had survived the cruelty of a world that judges women so much more harshly than men for the crime of following their hearts. He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after failing to shield you from the consequences of my impulsiveness, after leaving you to bear the weight of scandal alone. But Eleanor, sweet Eleanor, you must know that you have been the constant star by which I have navigated these 5 dark years, the hope that kept me human when war tried to make me into something else, the dream that brought me home when nothing else could. The fire crackled in the hearth as Eleanor stared at their joined hands, seeing the contrast between his scarred skin and her work-roughened fingers, feeling the truth of his words in every breath she drew, and slowly, carefully, as if she might shatter this moment like spun glass, she raised her eyes to meet his and saw there everything he had not yet said. All the love and longing and desperate hope that matched the feelings she had buried so deep, she had almost convinced herself they were dead. The fire had burned low in the hearth by the time Eleanor finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper while she stared at their joined hands, feeling the weight of Frederick's confession settling into her bones like the rain that now beat steadily against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy that made the outside world seem very far away. I do not know what to say, she managed at last, raising her eyes to meet his and seeing there such naked hope that it made her heart constrict painfully. You speak of things I had convinced myself were merely dreams, foolish fancies of a girl who did not understand the consequences of following her heart. And now you sit before me offering what I believed forever lost. Frederick's grip on her hands tightened fractionally, not enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her to this moment, to the reality of his presence and the truth written in every line of his scarred face as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to match hers. Then let me speak plainly once more, he said, and she could feel the tremor in his hands that betrayed his own emotional state despite his controlled exterior. I am asking for the privilege of courting you properly, openly, with the full intention of making you my Duchess if you will have me, and I care not one whit what society says about it. The sound of the front door opening made them both freeze, and Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized how close they had drawn to each other, how improper their position would appear to anyone entering. But she found she could not bring herself to pull her hands from his grasp, even as footsteps approached the parlour door. Lady Agnes entered with Pip shaking raindrops from his coat, and Eleanor saw her aunt's sharp eyes take in the scene before her, noting Eleanor's tear-stained face and their joined hands with an expression that shifted from concern to something softer, more knowing. "Forgive me for interrupting," Lady Agnes said mildly, though Eleanor could hear the slight tremor of emotion in her voice. But Pip insisted on returning home before we were both thoroughly soaked, and at my age one must choose one's battles wisely. Frederick rose smoothly, releasing Eleanor's hands with obvious reluctance, and bowed to Lady Agnes with perfect courtesy, despite the emotion still written clearly on his features. "Lady Whitmore, I have just asked your niece for permission to court her with honourable intentions, and I find myself awaiting her answer with more trepidation than I faced at Waterloo." Eleanor felt fresh tears threaten as she looked between Frederick's hopeful face and her aunt's encouraging expression, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered and terrified by her own desperate desire to accept it, to throw caution to the wind and embrace this second chance at happiness, despite all the reasons she should refuse. "I need time," she heard herself say, the words emerging without conscious thought. "This is all so sudden, so unexpected after so many years, and I find myself quite unable to think clearly with you looking at me that way." A ghost of a smile touched Frederick's lips, the first she had seen since his return, and it transformed his face so completely that she caught a glimpse of the young man who had kissed her in a moonlit garden a lifetime ago. "Time you shall have," he said gently. "I have waited 5 years. I can wait as long as you need to be certain, though I confess I hope it will not be another 5. He moved toward the door, pausing to collect his gloves and walking stick, and Eleanor noticed how he favored his injured leg more heavily now, as if the emotional toll of their conversation had weakened his physical defenses as well. "I will return in 1 week, if that is acceptable," he said, addressing both women, though his eyes remained on Eleanor. "And perhaps by then you will have found the clarity you seek." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him prepare to leave, thinking this was how it would end, with him walking away into the rain while she remained behind to wrestle with her doubts and fears alone. But at the door he paused, reaching into his coat pocket with movements that seemed almost hesitant, uncertain in a way she had not seen from him before. "I have carried this with me through 2 campaigns and more battles than I care to remember," he said quietly, drawing out something that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "And I think perhaps it is time it was returned to its rightful owner." He crossed back to her in 3 quick strides, pressing something soft and familiar into her palm before she could react. And then he was bowing again and moving toward the door with determined steps that spoke of a man who had said all he dared for 1 day. Eleanor stared down at the pale lavender ribbon in her hands, faded now from years of handling, and she could picture him carrying it through mud and blood and horror, this silly bit of silk that had fallen from her hair as he kissed her, and the tears she had been fighting finally spilled over as she clutched it to her chest. Through the parlor window she watched his carriage disappear into the grey curtain of rain, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling that she had built so carefully around her heart, letting in equal measures of hope and terror as she realized that he had been telling the truth, that Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornfield, the man they called Ruthless, had carried her memory through hell and back, and now stood ready to defy society itself for the chance to claim her as his own. The days following Frederick's departure passed with agonizing slowness for Eleanor, each morning bringing a peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread, as she found herself constantly touching the lavender ribbon she now wore wrapped around her wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve like a secret talisman, while she went about her daily routines of reading to Aunt Agnes and managing the small household. On the second evening, as they sat by the fire after a simple dinner, her aunt set aside her needlework and fixed Eleanor with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through all pretense, saying quietly, "My dear child, I believe it is time I shared something with you that I have told no one in 40 years. And Eleanor felt her breath catch as she recognized the pain that flickered across her aunt's weathered features. "When I was 24, exactly your age now, I was engaged to a young captain named Richard Drummond, a second son with nothing but his commission and a heart so true it could have lit all of London." Lady Agnes continued, her voice taking on a distant quality as she gazed into the flames. "But 3 weeks before our wedding, he was called to fight in the American War, and though he promised to return, though I waited and wrote and prayed, he fell at Saratoga and took with him all my dreams of happiness." Eleanor reached out to grasp her aunt's hand, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the soft skin. Understanding now why Lady Agnes had never married, why she lived alone in this cottage with only memories for company, and her aunt squeezed back with surprising strength as she continued, "I have spent 40 years wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to marry him before he left, if I had defied my parents who thought he was not good enough, if I had chosen love over propriety. And my dear Eleanor, I would not see you make the same mistake, not when that young man looks at you as if you hung the very stars." The conversation haunted Eleanor through the following days as she helped her aunt with increased tenderness, seeing in every gesture the ghost of the young woman who had chosen safety over passion and lived to regret it. And on the 4th day her contemplation was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing her mother's distinctive seal, the expensive paper and harsh angles of the writing filling her with familiar dread. "Eleanor," the letter began without preamble or affection, "I have received the most disturbing reports that the Duke of Thornfield has been seen visiting you at your aunt's cottage, and I must remind you that your disgrace 5 years ago nearly destroyed your sister's prospects and your father's standing in society, and I absolutely forbid you to entertain any delusions that his Grace's attention is anything more than a cruel game played by a bored aristocrat who has forgotten the harm he already caused our family." The words cut deep, as her mother had always known exactly where to strike, but Eleanor found herself crumpling the letter with unexpected fury, throwing it into the fire and watching the expensive paper curl and blacken while something fierce and protective rose within her chest, a determination that had been growing since Frederick placed that faded ribbon in her palm. "Good riddance," Aunt Agnes said mildly from her chair, having observed the entire scene. "Your mother always was a foolish woman who valued appearance over substance, and if she cannot see that the Duke's intentions are honorable, then she deserves no say in your future happiness." That night, Eleanor retrieved the pressed white rose from its hiding place in her poetry book, holding it up to the candlelight, and remembering the young man who had plucked it for her during one of their secret meetings, his eyes bright with promise as he tucked it behind her ear and whispered that someday he would fill her arms with roses every day if she would let him, and she realized with a start that he was trying to keep that promise now, scarred and changed, but still the same soul beneath. By the 6th day, Eleanor had made her decision, feeling it settle into her bones with a certainty that brought the first real peace she had known in years. And she found herself standing before her small mirror, practicing the words she would say when Frederick returned, wondering if he would see in her eyes the same recognition she had seen in his, the acknowledgement that whatever they had been to each other in that moonlit garden had not died, but merely lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Aunt Agnes, observing her niece's transformation with satisfaction, brought out a small miniature portrait on the evening before Frederick's return, showing Eleanor the face of Richard Drummond, forever young and handsome in his uniform, and said simply, "He would have wanted me to be happy, to choose joy over fear, and I believe your Frederick has earned his second chance, just as you have earned yours." The weather had cleared after days of rain, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming, and Eleanor took this as a sign as she prepared for bed. The lavender ribbon carefully placed on her dresser beside the poetry book, and the white rose, 3 tokens of a love that had survived scandal, war, and time itself, waiting only for her to be brave enough to claim it. The morning of September 15th dawned crisp and golden, autumn sunlight streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window as she dressed with trembling fingers in the soft blue dress she had worn the week before, the lavender ribbon wrapped carefully around her wrist beneath the sleeve, while she tried to calm the wild beating of her heart that had begun the moment she opened her eyes and remembered that today Frederick would return for her answer. She had barely touched her breakfast, pushing eggs around her plate, while Aunt Agnes watched with knowing eyes. And when the mantel clock struck 10, Eleanor found herself standing at the parlour window, watching the lane for any sign of his carriage, while her hands twisted together in an unconscious gesture of nerves that she could not seem to still. The sound of wheels on gravel made her breath catch, and she forced herself to step back from the window, to arrange herself on the settee with what dignity she could muster. Even as her pulse raced at the sight of the Ravenscroft crest gleaming in the morning sun. Frederick entered carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, his movements more fluid today, as if the clear weather had eased the ache in his injured leg, and Eleanor felt her resolve strengthen at the sight of the restrained hope in his grey eyes as he bowed formally before taking the chair across from her. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then seemed to check himself, a slight smile touching his lips as he corrected. "Eleanor, if I may still use that privilege, I find myself hoping that this week has brought you the clarity you sought. Though I confess I have counted each day with an impatience that would have amused my fellow officers who knew me as a man of legendary patience in battle." His attempt at lightness could not quite mask the tension in his shoulders, the way his scarred hands gripped the package as if it anchored him, and Eleanor felt her own nervousness ease slightly at this evidence that he was as affected as she by this moment. "Before you give me your answer," he continued, setting the package on the small table between them, "I brought you something. A small token that I hope will convey better than words what these visits have meant to me." Eleanor reached for the package with hands that trembled only slightly, carefully unwrapping the brown paper to reveal a book bound in deep green leather with gold lettering along the spine. And she gasped softly as she recognized it as a first edition of the very volume of poetry she had been reading to Aunt Agnes on his first visit. "I noticed your copy was well loved, but falling apart," Frederick said quietly, watching her run her fingers over the pristine leather binding. "And I thought perhaps you might enjoy having one that would survive many more years of reading, though I hope you will not need to find solace in poetry alone much longer." The thoughtfulness of the gift, the evidence of his attention to such a small detail of her life, broke through Eleanor's last defenses, and she looked up to meet his eyes with tears threatening to spill over as she said clearly, "Frederick, I have spent this week trying to find reasons to refuse you, trying to protect myself from the possibility of hope, but I find that my aunt's wisdom and my own heart have conspired against my fear. And so yes, I accept your courtship with all that it implies." The joy that transformed his face was almost too much to witness, years seeming to fall away as he smiled with such genuine happiness that Eleanor found herself smiling in return, the first true smile they had shared since that long-ago night in a moonlit garden. He rose from his chair and crossed to sit beside her on the settee, maintaining a proper distance but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him as he said, "You have made me happier than I believed possible after all these years, and I promise you that I will court you with all the honor and devotion you deserve, visiting as often as you will permit, though I warn you that twice weekly may not be enough to satisfy my eagerness to know you again." Aunt Agnes chose that moment to appear in the doorway, Pip trotting at her heels, and her sharp eyes took in their proximity and Eleanor's radiant face with obvious satisfaction. "Your Grace," she said with a knowing smile, "I believe the garden is particularly lovely this morning, if you and Eleanor would care to take a turn, and I find myself suddenly in need of a long nap after all the excitement of the week." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at her aunt's transparent manoeuvring, but Frederick rose and offered his arm with such formal courtesy that she could not help but be charmed, and soon they were stepping out into the autumn sunshine, the garden path strewn with golden leaves that crunched beneath their feet as they walked. "Twice weekly, then," Eleanor confirmed as they paused beneath an apple tree heavy with fruit. "Though I warn you that life at Willowmere Cottage is exceedingly quiet, and you may find yourself bored with our simple routines." Frederick's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his touch warm even through their gloves as he replied, "My dear Eleanor, after years of war and chaos, I find the prospect of quiet afternoons in your company to be nothing short of paradise, and I suspect I shall count the days between visits with the same impatience I showed this week." They stayed in the garden for nearly an hour, talking of books and music and carefully avoiding the heavier topics that would come in time. And when Frederick finally took his leave after a full 2 hours, Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage disappear down the lane while clutching her new book to her chest, feeling as if she had stepped from shadow into sunlight after 5 long years of darkness. The autumn afternoon of September 22nd arrived with a gentle rain that pattered against the cottage windows as Eleanor arranged fresh dahlias in a vase, humming softly to herself in a way that made Aunt Agnes smile knowingly from her chair, for the change in her niece over the past week had been remarkable to witness, colour returning to her cheeks and a lightness to her step that had been absent for 5 long years. When Frederick's carriage arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, Eleanor found herself meeting him at the door with genuine pleasure rather than nervous anticipation, though she noticed immediately that something was different about him today, a tension in his shoulders and shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a difficult night. They settled into what had become their customary positions in the parlour, he in the chair nearest the fire, and she on the settee with her needlework, though she found herself setting it aside as she studied his face, noting how he rubbed absently at his scarred jaw in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of disquiet. "You seem troubled today," she ventured gently after Aunt Agnes had retired for her afternoon rest, leaving them in the comfortable privacy that had become so precious during these visits. And Frederick looked up at her with something like surprise, as if unaccustomed to having his moods so easily read. "I forget sometimes that you see through my defenses as easily now as you did when we were young," he said with a rueful smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Though I suppose I should not be surprised, as you were always the only one who could tell when something weighed upon my mind." The rain intensified against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the small parlour as Eleanor rose from her seat and moved to sit beside him, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a week ago but now felt as natural as breathing. "Will you tell me what troubles you?" she asked softly, and Frederick was quiet for a long moment before speaking, his voice taking on a distant quality that made her heart ache. "Last night I dreamed of Waterloo again," he began, his grey eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Though I suppose dream is too gentle a word for the memories that visit me in the darkness, memories of mud and blood, and the screams of horses, of holding James Sinclair's intestines inside his body while he begged me to write to his mother, of stepping over the bodies of boys who had trusted me to lead them home." Eleanor reached out instinctively to take his hand, feeling the tremor that ran through him as he continued. "I woke calling your name, as I often did in those hellish days when the only thing that kept me sane was the memory of your smile in a moonlit garden, and I realized that I have not told you the truth of what I became in those years, the things I did to survive and to ensure my men survived, things that earned me the title of ruthless duke but cost me pieces of my soul I fear I shall never recover." His confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful, and Eleanor squeezed his hand tighter as she chose her words carefully, understanding that this was a test of sorts, that he was offering her the chance to flee before their courtship progressed further. "Frederick," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears that threatened, "do you think me such a delicate flower that I would turn from you because you bear scars that are not visible on your skin? Or that I would judge you for doing what was necessary to survive a horror I cannot even imagine?" He looked at her then with such vulnerable hope that her heart broke a little, and she continued, "You speak of losing pieces of your soul, but I see a man who carried the weight of his men's lives, who still carries their memories with honor, and who, despite everything he endured, still had the courage to seek love when he might have hidden behind his title and his wounds." Frederick's hand turned in hers, their fingers interlacing with a rightness that made her breath catch. And when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "James survived, you know, though he lost his right arm and retired to Scotland, and he told me during my darkest moments that any man who could speak of a woman the way I spoke of you had something worth living for, something worth returning to, even if I believed myself too changed to deserve it." The fire crackled in the hearth as they sat in companionable silence, hands clasped while the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows. And Eleanor marveled at how natural it felt to offer comfort to this man, who had once been a carefree youth, but had returned tempered by experiences she could only semi-comprehend. "I worry sometimes," she admitted quietly, "about what society will say when you choose to make our courtship public, whether I have the strength to face their whispers and speculation after hiding away for so long, whether I might disappoint you when faced with the glittering world you must inhabit as Duke of Thornfield." Frederick's thumb traced gentle circles against her palm as he replied, "My dear Eleanor, society can whisper all it likes, but I have faced French cavalry charges and survived, and I assure you that Lady Jersey's disapproval pales in comparison, besides which I have a secret weapon in Lady Maria Greville, who has already written to say she is delighted I have finally come to my senses and sought out the only woman she ever thought worthy of me." The mention of Lady Greville, one of society's most influential matrons, made Eleanor's eyes widen in surprise, for she had been kind to Eleanor before the scandal, and her support would make all the difference in their reception. "She remembers you with great fondness," Frederick continued, with the first genuine smile she had seen from him today, "and has declared her intention to host a dinner in our honor once you feel ready to venture back into society, though I have told her that decision rests entirely with you, and I am content to court you here in this cottage for as long as you wish." The rain was beginning to ease as the afternoon wore on, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast patterns on the worn carpet, and Eleanor found herself imagining a future she had never dared envision, one where she walked on Frederick's arm not in shadow but in light, where the wounds they both carried might heal through the simple act of being seen and loved despite them. The leaves had turned brilliant gold and crimson by October 10th, when Eleanor found herself standing before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her in a gown of deep forest green that Aunt Agnes had insisted on ordering from the village seamstress, declaring that no niece of hers would face society in grey when she had such a handsome duke courting her. 3 weeks had passed since she accepted Frederick's courtship. 3 weeks of twice-weekly visits that had gradually transformed from formal afternoon calls to long, rambling conversations that stretched late into the evening, during which they had rediscovered the easy companionship of their youth, while building something deeper, something tempered by the trials they had both endured. Today marked a significant step forward, for Frederick was taking her to meet Lady Maria Greville at her estate just an hour's drive away, their first venture into society as a courting couple, and Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the emerald earrings that had been her grandmother's, a family treasure she had not worn in 5 years. The sound of Frederick's carriage approaching made her heart leap, and she descended the stairs to find him waiting in the parlour. Resplendent in a dark green coat that made his grey eyes appear almost silver, and the warm approval in his gaze when he saw her made all her nervousness worthwhile. "You look radiant," he said simply, taking her gloved hand and pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar over these past weeks, though it never failed to send warmth spreading through her chest. And Eleanor managed to smile despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach at the thought of facing society's scrutiny once more. The carriage ride passed in comfortable conversation, Frederick regaling her with stories of Lady Greville's legendary wit and her habit of collecting what she called interesting people, regardless of their social standing. And Eleanor found her anxiety easing under the steady warmth of his presence and the way his hand occasionally covered hers in reassurance. Lady Greville's estate proved to be a charming manor house of honey-coloured stone surrounded by immaculate gardens, and Eleanor's nerves returned full force as their carriage swept up the drive, but Frederick squeezed her hand gently and murmured, "Remember, she specifically requested to meet you again, and Maria Greville does not issue invitations lightly." The lady herself greeted them in the drawing-room, a handsome woman of perhaps 60 years, with sharp blue eyes and silver hair arranged in an elegant coiffure, and Eleanor dropped into a curtsy, surprised when Lady Greville immediately crossed the room to take both her hands with genuine warmth. "My dear Miss Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "How delightful to see you again after all these years, though I must say you look far better now than when I last saw you at that dreadful Somerset garden party, probably because you have the good sense to be courted by a man of actual worth rather than those insipid puppies who used to cluster around you." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at this frank reference to her past, but Lady Greville's smile was kind rather than cruel as she continued, "Frederick has told me something of your current circumstances, and I must say I admire a woman who chooses dignity and useful employment over throwing herself on the mercy of relatives who do not appreciate her value, though I do hope you will allow me to remedy society's shameful treatment of you." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of conversation and laughter, Lady Greville proving to be every bit as witty and unconventional as Frederick had promised, regaling them with scandalous stories of various society figures, while extracting Eleanor's own history with a gentle persistence that somehow made the telling less painful than Eleanor had expected. "Now then," Lady Greville said as tea was served, fixing Frederick with a stern look that was belied by the twinkle in her eyes, "I trust you intend to make an honest woman of Miss Ashworth before much longer, because I fully intend to sponsor her return to society, and I need to know whether I am launching her as your betrothed or merely as a woman being courted, the strategy being quite different for each scenario." Frederick's eyes found Eleanor's across the tea table, and something in his expression made her breath catch as he replied calmly, "That decision rests entirely with Eleanor, but I assure you my intentions are entirely honourable, and my hope is that she will accept me when she feels ready to do so." The remainder of the visit passed pleasantly, with Lady Greville insisting they must attend her autumn ball in 2 weeks' time, brushing aside Eleanor's protests about lack of appropriate attire with an airy wave and a promise to have her own modest call at Willowmere Cottage. And by the time they took their leave, Eleanor felt as if she had been swept up in a benevolent whirlwind. The carriage ride home was quieter, both of them processing the significance of the afternoon, and Eleanor found herself studying Frederick's profile as he gazed out at the passing countryside, noting how the late afternoon sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair and highlighted the noble lines of his scarred face. "Thank you," she said softly, and he turned to her with a questioning look that prompted her to continue, "for understanding that I needed an ally like Lady Greville, for not rushing me, for being patient while I find my courage again." His hand found hers in the dim interrumsor of the carriage, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm as he replied, "My dear Eleanor, your courage never left you. It simply went into hiding for a while, and I count myself fortunate to witness its return. Besides which, Lady Greville has been trying to matchmake for me since I returned from war, and I suspect she is delighted to finally have her efforts bear fruit." The familiar landmarks of Willowmere village came into view as dusk began to fall, and Eleanor realized with a start that she had not once thought about her mother's disapproval or society's whispers during the entire afternoon, too caught up in the simple pleasure of being treated as a woman of worth rather than a social pariah. As Frederick handed her down from the carriage and escorted her to the cottage door, Eleanor impulsively rose on her toes to press a soft kiss to his scarred cheek, feeling him go still beneath her touch before his arms came around her in a gentle embrace that lasted only a moment, but left them both breathless. "2 weeks," he said roughly as he stepped back, his eyes dark with emotion. 2 weeks until the ball. And I find myself wondering how I shall manage to stay away until Thursday." Eleanor smiled, feeling more like her old self than she had in 5 years, as she replied with something approaching her former spirit. "Perhaps Lady Greville was right about your intentions requiring swift action, Your Grace, for I find that patience, once disturbed, is difficult to reclaim." She slipped inside before he could respond, but not before catching sight of the joy that transformed his features, and as she leaned against the closed door, listening to his carriage depart, Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips and wondered if perhaps fairy tales might sometimes come true after all, even for overlooked spinsters who had long since given up on happy endings. The preparations for Lady Greville's autumn ball consumed the following days in a whirlwind of activity that left Eleanor both exhilarated and exhausted, for true to her word, Lady Greville's personal modiste had arrived at Willowmere Cottage with an assistant and enough fabric samples to outfit a small army, declaring that Miss Ashworth would be the talk of the evening in the best possible way if she had anything to say about it. October 20th dawned crisp and clear, and Eleanor stood before her mirror, hardly recognizing the woman reflected there in a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, her hair arranged in an elegant style that Charlotte's hastily dispatched lady's maid had spent 2 hours perfecting, small sapphires borrowed from Aunt Agnes glittering at her throat and ears like captured tears of joy. When Frederick arrived to collect her that evening, the expression on his face as she descended the stairs made every moment of preparation worthwhile, his grey eyes darkening with an emotion that made her pulse quicken as he took her gloved hand and murmured, "You are absolutely breathtaking, though I confess I am torn between wanting to show you off to all of society and keeping you entirely to myself." The carriage ride to Lady Greville's estate passed in a blur of nervous anticipation, Eleanor's fingers unconsciously playing with the lavender ribbon she wore wrapped around her wrist beneath her long gloves, a talisman against the fears that threatened to overwhelm her as they drew closer to her first society event in 5 years. Frederick seemed to sense her growing anxiety, for he shifted closer on the carriage seat and took her hand in his thumb tracing soothing circles through the thin kid leather as he said quietly, "Remember, you face them not as the girl who was cast out, but as the woman who captured the heart of the ruthless Duke, and I dare anyone to speak a word against you in my presence." The blaze of lights from Lady Greville's manor house made Eleanor's breath catch as their carriage joined the line of vehicles depositing elegantly dressed guests at the entrance, and she could already hear the strains of music drifting through the autumn air, along with the sound of laughter and conversation that made her stomach tighten with remembered humiliation. As they entered the ballroom, a gradual hush fell over the assembled company, hundreds of eyes turning to stare at the Duke of Thornfield and his companion, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat as society matrons raised their lorgnettes and young ladies behind their fans exchanged shocked glances at the sight of the disgraced Eleanor Ashworth on the arm of one of the most eligible men in England. Lady Greville appeared at their side immediately, resplendent in purple silk and diamonds, her voice carrying clearly as she declared, "Thornfield, Miss Ashworth, how delightful that you could join us," before turning to address the room at large with a smile that held dead just a hint of steel. "I trust you all remember Miss Ashworth, who has been caring for her dear aunt these past years in a display of familial devotion that puts many of us to shame." The next hour passed in a careful dance of social navigation as Lady Greville introduced them to carefully selected allies, each interaction building a wall of protection around Eleanor, even as she felt the weight of speculative stares and caught fragments of whispered conversations that made her cheeks burn, though Frederick's steady presence at her side, and the way he looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the room, gave her strength to hold her head high. The moment of truth came when the musicians struck up a waltz, and Frederick turned to her with an extended hand and a question in his eyes that made her heart race, even as she felt the weight of every gaze in the ballroom upon them. Waiting to see if the disgraced Eleanor Ashworth would dare to dance with the Duke of Thornfield in full view of the society that had cast her out. She placed her trembling hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor, aware of the shocked whispers that followed in their wake like the train of her gown. But as Frederick's arm came around her waist and they began to move to the music, the rest of the world seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the waltz that carried them across the polished floor. "Breathe, my dear," Frederick murmured close to her ear as they turned, his voice carrying a note of tender amusement. "You are doing beautifully. And I must confess that holding you in my arms again, after so many years of dreaming about it, is worth every disapproving stare in this ballroom." Eleanor managed a shaky laugh, finding her rhythm as muscle memory from years of dancing lessons returned, and she dared to look up into his face to find him gazing down at her with such open adoration that it took her breath away more effectively than the exercise of the dance itself. Around them, she caught glimpses of familiar faces from her past, some watching with barely concealed spite, while others seemed genuinely pleased to see her returned to society. And she spotted Lady Beatrice Pembroke near the refreshment table, her face pinched with displeasure as she whispered furiously to her companion. The sight of Frederick's cousin, the woman who had exposed their innocent kiss and set in motion 5 years of exile and heartache, might have once reduced Eleanor to tears, but now, held securely in Frederick's arms as they moved through the elegant figures of the waltz, she found that Lady Beatrice's malice had lost its power to wound her. "She cannot hurt us now," Frederick said quietly, having followed the direction of her gaze, his hand tightening slightly at her waist in a gesture of protection and possession that sent warmth flooding through her. "Whatever poison she attempts to spread will find no purchase here, not with Lady Greville as our champion, and certainly not while you wear my ring upon your finger." The words were spoken so casually that it took Eleanor a moment to process their meaning, and she stumbled slightly in the dance, causing Frederick to steady her with a rueful smile as he continued, "Forgive me, that was poorly done, but I find that being near you after so long apart has rather scattered my ability to follow proper form, though I had intended to wait until we were somewhere more private to make my formal declaration." Eleanor's mind reeled as they continued to dance, her body following the steps automatically, while her thoughts raced to comprehend that Frederick had just obliquely proposed marriage in the middle of a crowded ballroom, and she found herself torn between laughter and tears at the absurdity and wonder of it all. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you actually proposing to me while we waltz at Lady Greville's autumn ball with half of society watching our every move?" Frederick's smile widened. transforming his scarred face into something almost boyish as he replied, "It seems I am, though I promise to do it properly later with bended knee and all the pretty speeches you deserve. But I find I can no longer bear the thought of you doubting for even one more moment that my intentions toward you are anything less than a lifetime commitment." The music swelled around them as other couples joined them on the dance floor, providing a measure of privacy in the midst of the crowd, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as the full weight of his words settled over her like a benediction, washing away the last lingering doubts that had haunted her since his return. The waltz came to an end far too soon for Eleanor's liking, and as Frederick escorted her from the dance floor, she became aware once more of the watching eyes and whispered speculations that followed their progress, though now they seemed less threatening and more like the buzzing of inconsequential insects compared to the magnitude of what had just passed between them. Lady Greville intercepted them near the French doors that opened onto the terrace, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed delight as she observed, "My dear Thornfield, Miss Ashworth, you dance together as if you have been partners for years rather than reunited so recently, though I suppose the heart has its own memory that transcends mere time." Before either could respond, she had whisked Eleanor away with a murmured excuse about introducing her to some particular friends, leaving Frederick to be cornered by Captain Sinclair, who had appeared at the ball in full dress uniform, his presence lending additional consequence to their party. Eleanor found herself in a whirlwind of introductions to carefully selected matrons who had known her before her disgrace, each of whom seemed primed by Lady Greville to receive her warmly. And she began to understand the older woman's strategy of rebuilding her social standing through a network of influential allies who would make it difficult for the Lady Beatrices of the world to spread their poison. Through it all, she remained achingly aware of Frederick's presence across the room, catching glimpses of him in conversation with various gentlemen, his bearing commanding respect despite, or perhaps because of the visible marks of his service, and several times their eyes met across the crowded space, with a connection that made her pulse quicken. When the supper bell rang and the company began moving toward the dining room, Frederick appeared at her elbow as if materialized from thin air, offering his arm with a smile that was both protective and possessive as he murmured, "I believe Lady Greville has arranged for us to be seated together, though I would have found a way to claim that privilege regardless of the seating arrangements." The supper was a trial of a different sort, for while Eleanor found herself seated between Frederick and the kindly Lord Pemberton, who regaled her with stories of his orchid collection, directly across from her sat Lady Beatrice, whose face grew increasingly pinched as the meal progressed, and it became clear that Eleanor's return to society was not only accepted, but actively championed by their hostess. Conversation flowed around the table, touching on topics from the weather to the latest parliamentary debates, and Eleanor found her confidence growing as she contributed thoughtful observations that drew approving nods from several diners, while Frederick's quiet pride in her accomplishment warmed her more thoroughly than the excellent wine. It was as the dessert course was being served that Lady Beatrice finally struck, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by their immediate neighbours as she remarked with false sweetness, "How touching to see such devotion to duty, Miss Ashworth, though I do hope your years in the countryside have not left you too far behind in the social graces required of a duchess." The table fell silent at this barely veiled attack, forks suspended midway to mouths as the company waited to see how Eleanor would respond to this first direct assault, and she felt Frederick tense beside her, his hand moving as if to intervene before she gently touched his arm to stay him, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. Looking up at Lady Beatrice with a calmness that surprised even herself, Eleanor set down her dessert fork with deliberate precision and met her tormentor's gaze steadily as she replied in a voice that carried just as clearly, "How kind of you to concern yourself with my readiness, Lady Beatrice, though I confess I find the requirements of a duchess to be remarkably similar to those of any woman of good character and sound judgment, qualities which I trust have only been strengthened by my years away from the more superficial aspects of society." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor felt rather than saw the approval rippling through their dinner companions, particularly from Lady Greville, who raised her wine glass in a subtle salute, while Frederick's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of support that gave her courage to continue. "Indeed," Eleanor added with a slight smile that held no warmth for Frederick's cousin. "I have found that distance often provides clarity about what truly matters in life, and I am grateful for the lessons learned during my time in the countryside, lessons about resilience, dignity, and the importance of genuine kindness over mere social posturing." Lady Beatrice's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red as she realized her barb had not only failed to wound, but had somehow elevated her intended victim, and she opened her mouth as if to respond before Lord Pemberton intervened with remarkable timing, turning the conversation to his recent success with a particularly rare orchid hybrid, effectively cutting off any further attacks. The remainder of the supper passed without incident, though Eleanor remained acutely aware of the undercurrents flowing around the table, the way certain matrons nodded approvingly when she spoke, the calculating looks from younger ladies who were clearly reassessing their initial dismissal of her, and most of all, Frederick's quiet pride emanating from beside her like a protective shield. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Eleanor found herself immediately surrounded by a carefully orchestrated group of allies, with Lady Greville at the helm, ensuring that any attempts by Lady Beatrice to spread her poison were immediately countered by warm reminiscences of Eleanor's accomplishments before her exile. "My dear," Lady Greville murmured during a brief lull in conversation, drawing Eleanor slightly aside, "you handled that beautifully at dinner, with just the right amount of steel beneath the silk, and I do believe you have won over several important figures who were prepared to follow Lady Beatrice's lead in shunning you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness from a woman who owed her nothing, and she whispered her gratitude even as Lady Greville waved it away with a gentle laugh, insisting that she was merely facilitating what should never have been interrupted in the first place, that rare and precious thing called true love. The gentlemen rejoined them sooner than usual, and Eleanor's pulse quickened as Frederick's tall figure appeared in the doorway, his eyes immediately seeking and finding her across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she watched as he made his way toward her with purposeful strides that brooked no interference from those who might have sought to waylay him. He reached her side just as the musicians in the far corner began tuning their instruments for the next set of dancers, and without preamble he offered his arm with a quiet intensity that brooked no refusal, guiding her toward the French doors that opened onto Lady Greville's terrace, where the cool night air promised respite from the warmth of the crowded drawing-room and the weight of so many watching eyes. The terrace was not empty, for several couples had sought the same refuge, but Frederick led her to a secluded corner where a stone balustrade overlooked the moonlit garden below, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she realized how deliberately he had maneuvered them to this moment of relative privacy, close enough to propriety that no scandal could attach itself, yet far enough from curious ears that they might speak freely. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence between them charged with all that had passed this evening and all that remained unspoken, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of the heat emanating from his body, where he stood close beside her, the faint scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that transported her back 5 years to a rose arbor and a stolen kiss that had changed the course of her life. When Frederick finally broke the silence, his voice was rough with emotion as he said, "You were magnificent tonight, Eleanor, facing down Beatrice with such grace and steel that I found myself falling in love with you all over again, if indeed I had ever stopped." and the use of her Christian name without the formal Miss sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. She turned to face him then, finding his features silvered by moonlight, the scar along his jaw somehow less fearsome in this gentle illumination, and more a testament to the battles he had survived to return to her. And she whispered, "I was so frightened, Frederick, not of her words, but of disappointing you, of proving that perhaps society was right to cast me out, and I am not worthy of the position you would elevate me to." His response was immediate and fierce as he captured both her hands in his, "Propriety be damned in this shadowed corner," and his eyes blazed with an intensity that stole her breath as he declared, "You are worthy of far more than I could ever offer, Eleanor. And if society cannot see your value, then society is blind and foolish, and I care nothing for its opinion." The passion in his voice made her heart race, and she found herself swaying slightly toward him, drawn by the magnetic pull that had existed between them since that fateful garden party 5 years ago, a connection that neither time nor distance nor the cruelties of war and exile had managed to sever. From inside the drawing-room came the strains of music beginning again, and Eleanor knew they should return before their absence was noted and commented upon, yet she found herself reluctant to break this spell, this perfect moment suspended in moonlight, where the world consisted only of Frederick's warm hands holding hers and his eyes promising her everything she had once believed lost forever. And when he raised her fingers to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, she felt tears spring to her eyes at the tenderness of the gesture from a man the world called ruthless. They returned to the drawing-room just as the dance concluded, and Eleanor felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere as they entered, the way conversations paused almost imperceptibly before resuming with studied casualness, and she knew that their absence had been noted and catalogued by the assembled guests, though Lady Greville's immediate approach with warm inquiries about whether Eleanor had enjoyed the fresh air served to deflect any whispered speculation before it could take root. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of careful social maneuvering, with Eleanor increasingly aware that she was being assessed and measured by every matron and debutante in attendance, weighed against some invisible standard that would determine whether she might be accepted back into the fold or forever relegated to the margins of polite society, and yet she found that the terror which had gripped her earlier had transformed into something resembling determination, a quiet resolve that surprised her with its steadiness. Frederick remained close throughout, his presence a bulwark against the more pointed glances, and when Lady Beatrice attempted one final sally during the distribution of wraps in the entrance hall, a comment about how certain flowers bloom too late in the season to be of any use, it was Captain Sinclair who intervened with devastating charm, remarking loudly that late-blooming roses were often the most fragrant, and that he had always found early blossoms rather insipid in comparison, drawing laughter from several nearby gentlemen, and leaving Lady Beatrice with spots of colour burning high on her cheeks. The carriage ride back to the Ashworth townhouse, where Eleanor was staying as a concession to propriety during her London visit, was quiet but comfortable, with Frederick holding her hand openly now that they were away from watching eyes, his thumb tracing small circles against her palm in a gesture that sent warmth spreading through her chest, despite the chill of the autumn night pressing against the carriage windows. When they arrived, Frederick helped her down with exquisite care, and in the brief moment before the door opened, he leaned close and murmured against her ear that she had conquered them all tonight, that he had never been more certain of his choice, and the words wrapped around her heart like a promise she was finally allowing herself to believe. Sleep did not come easily that night, for Eleanor lay awake replaying every moment, every small victory and near disaster, every instance where she had found strength she had not known she possessed. And as the first pale light of dawn crept through her curtains, she realized that something fundamental had shifted within her, that the woman who had arrived in London a fortnight ago, trembling with doubt and braced for rejection, had begun to transform into someone who might actually deserve the love being offered to her. She rose early and penned a letter to Aunt Agnes, describing the evening in detail that would make the dear woman smile. And as she sealed it with wax, she caught sight of the lavender ribbon still tied at her wrist, faded but precious, a talisman connecting her past hopes to her present joy and her future promise, and she pressed her lips to it briefly before calling for the letter to be posted, feeling for the first time in 5 years that perhaps the world was not entirely without mercy. The days following Lady Greville's musicale brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the texture of Eleanor's London existence, for where before she had been merely tolerated as the Duke of Thornfield's curious choice, she now found herself regarded with something approaching genuine interest, invitations arriving at the Ashworth townhouse with increasing frequency and bearing names that would have been unthinkable a mere fortnight prior. And though Lady Harriet remained coldly disapproving in her interactions with her eldest daughter, even she could not entirely suppress a gleam of satisfaction when the Countess of Westbrook requested Eleanor's presence at an intimate afternoon gathering reserved for only the most select members of the ton. Frederick called each morning now, propriety be damned, his carriage appearing in the street below Eleanor's window with such regularity that the neighbouring households had begun to set their clocks by his arrival, and these visits had transformed from the stilted formal exchanges of their early courtship into something far more precious, conversations that wandered freely from literature to philosophy to shared memories both painful and sweet, punctuated by increasingly bold touches that left Eleanor breathless and counting the hours until she might see him again. It was during one such morning visit, with pale October sunlight streaming through the parlour windows and the first fallen leaves of autumn skittering past the glass, that Frederick produced a small velvet box from his coat pocket and placed it in Eleanor's hands with an expression of such tender vulnerability that her heart clenched in her chest, and when she opened it to find a ring of exquisite delicacy, a sapphire the precise colour of the dress she had worn when she accepted his courtship, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars, she found herself utterly unable to speak. He explained in low tones that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had defied her family to marry for love and never once regretted her choice, and that he had carried it through every battle, every desperate charge, every night spent shivering in muddy trenches, wondering if dawn would bring his death, because it represented everything he was fighting to return to, everything he hoped might still be possible, despite the ruin the war had made of him. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted the ring from its velvet nest, and when Frederick gently took it from her fingers and slid it onto her left hand, the cool weight of it felt like an anchor securing her to a future she had long ago abandoned hope of claiming, and the tears that slipped down her cheeks were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it bordered on pain. He kissed her then, properly kissed her for the first time since that fateful evening in Lady Somerset's rose arbor 5 years ago, and the sensation of his lips against hers, gentle yet certain, unhurried yet hungry, erased every lonely night and bitter morning that had passed between that moment and this, rewriting her history into a story that had always been moving toward this inevitable destination. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Frederick pressed his forehead against hers and whispered that he wished to marry her before the month was out, that he could not bear to wait longer when they had already lost so many years. And Eleanor found herself nodding before conscious thought could intervene, agreeing to become the Duchess of Thornfield, with the same instinctive certainty that had drawn her to him in a moonlit garden when she was 19 and believed that love conquered all, a belief she was only now beginning to reclaim.